Tales from the Mekong Delta. Karma is a bitch. Part 1. At 23 years old, Juan was the eldest son of 5 brothers and 2 sisters, coming from a farming family in the mountain province of the Philippines. Since childhood, he'd known nothing but the farming life, getting up usually before 4 a.m. to tend to the chickens and goats, or to take the old family water buffalo to plough the fields. By the age of 13, he'd already taken up smoking and drinking, but aside from those vices, life was simple, except for the fact that he was part Japanese. Growing up a half-breed made him the immediate target of bullies and vengeful townsfolks, who still felt bitter enmity against the Japanese for what they'd done during their conquest of the Philippines nearly 20 years ago. Still, he was the eldest son and therefore expected to be the breadwinner of the family. Money was tight, with 7 siblings approaching high school age and a rather resentful mother expecting him to bring home a decent salary while also doing farm labor. Juan was in a rather difficult position. It was 1964, and the United States was in the early stages of its long, torturous descent into the Vietnam conflict. America had established large military facilities on the Philippines, the strategically located island nation which was so important to winning the Pacific Campaign against the Japanese during World War II. Since then, those bases had grown in importance as a deterrent against communist expansion in Asia. The U.S. Naval Base at Subic Bay and Clark Air Force Base in Angeles City were the largest bases of their kind outside of the United States, and considerable men, money, and material had been invested into making these 2 bases the most powerful deterrent to communism in Southeast Asia. The United States Navy, anticipating the coming need for eager young recruits necessary to fill the yeomanry work aboard ship as the war in Vietnam escalated, put forth a call to all young able-bodied Filipino males. "We want you to join us for adventure and the opportunity to see the world. If you have the physical ability, the mental acuity and sharpness, and an excellent grasp of the English language, then you too can serve in the greatest navy in the entire world." Written in English and Tagalog, these posters were hung all over the local community colleges. The words were emblazoned over pictures of mighty ships, futuristic jet fighters, proud white sailors, and flags of the American and Philippine flags flying side by side. In exchange for signing a 4 to 6 year service contract with the United States government, America offered young Filipino men who met the prerequisite requirements a far better salary than what he might earn in his home country, though still much less than an equivalent American sailor, and military benefits while in service, a chance to see the world, and the opportunity for U.S. citizenship. The understood part, the part which was left off the recruiting posters and pamphlets, was that this would also include at least 1 tour of duty in Vietnam, though this was a small price to pay for many struggling young Filipino men still trying to rebuild their nation after the devastation of World War II. Juan's mother had strongly advised him against going to Subic Bay, whose large presence of unruly American sailors also brought along a huge multitude of dance clubs, bars, prostitutes, brothels, cantinas, and drug dealers. Many sailors returned to America from duty in the Philippines with tales of attesting to the fact that, Las Vegas was like Disneyland compared to what happened at Subic Bay. In her words, Juan's mother described Subic Bay as a wretched hive of scum and villainy. Still, despite the tremendous odds stacked against him, and knowing that his path would eventually lead to him being involved in the war against the evil communist empire, the poor, struggling farm boy left his secluded farming village high in the Philippine mountains and made his way towards the U.S. Naval Base in Subic Bay. This was a crazy thing he was attempting to do, and the chances for success were exceedingly slim. Even if he defied the odds and joined the U.S. Navy, his next stop would surely be in a war zone. That was why the US Navy put out the call in the first place. Still, the rewards far, far exceeded the risks in young Juan's mind. He had a family to support, and his honor to defend. He was essentially ostracized from his hometown, and in many respects from his own family, so he had nothing to lose. Besides, he was determined not to live his life known as just the poor bastard son of a Japanese soldier. It was roughly 150 miles from his farming village to the sprawling US Navy base. With what little money he had saved, and with help from distant family relatives who were able to lend him a few extra pesos, Juan was able to purchase the articles which the Navy told the recruit hopefuls to bring: running shoes, towels, toilet articles, and a change of clothes. His bus ticket, however, brought him only 30 miles shy of the base. He'd have to walk the rest of the way. While on the bus, which frankly was the most luxurious ride he'd ever been on, Juan was surprised to find that most of the passengers which crowded the seats were young men like him who were headed to Subic. The young men had come from all over the province for the chance to join, and Juan even ran into 3 distant cousins of his. They weren't close, Juan's cousins being relatively wealthy, while Juan was just, well, the bastard son of a Japanese soldier. They sat together a few rows behind Juan, clearly indicating that his company was not welcomed. Instead, Juan took a seat next to an older-aged man as the bus began its long trip down the mountain province towards Subic. The person Juan sat next to was a 29-year-old sad-faced man, just barely below the age limits. His family owned a fairly successful grocery store and restaurant in the town next to Juan's, but he'd decided to join the American Navy as his son had grown ill with a rare disease, and the US military medical benefits were his son's last best hope for treatment. Introducing himself as Joseph, he said that this was his second attempt to join the Navy, and in fact, for over half the men on the bus, this was at least their second attempt. Juan's heart sank. He didn't have the money to try this again if he failed. Seeing as Joseph had been there before, Juan inquired about the experience and what it was like. Joseph explained that recruit qualification was held every 3 months, in which 3,000 Filipino males aged 17 to 30 were invited to come to Subic Bay to try for a slot for advancement to actual Navy training. Beforehand, though, each Filipino recruit had to first pass a rigorous testing process at their local schools, which included science, math, English language comprehension, and a physical fitness program. Those who achieved the highest scores would then receive an invitation by the US Navy to come to Subic Bay, where the rail testing would begin. Even those with prior training with the Philippine military needed to compete for an invitation, despite rank or experience. Testing began at 6 a.m. sharp tomorrow morning, and the gates to the testing facility closed at that time, the Americans not allowing anyone to enter after that time, even if they had an invitation. Luckily enough, said Joseph, they would be in Unthinkable city before dark, and the Americans would put the recruits up in a nice barracks and would feed them dinner and breakfast. Unfortunately, Juan had to get off at the stop which was 30 miles from the base, and his cousins looked down on him derisively from the windows as the bus pulled away. It was afternoon as Juan began his walk to the base across the dusty, humid, hilly green landscape. Traveling through the night, he followed the street signs towards the base. Towards morning, the traffic in the streets got busier, and Juan felt a bit more comfortable to see that many streetcars and taxicabs were occupied by Americans wearing military uniforms. His long journey was coming to a close. Olongapo City was nothing like the farming village that he'd grown up in. Even at 4 a.m. in the morning, the bright neon lights of the bars and nightclubs were still on, though they would be closing soon. Hungry but having no money to buy something to eat, Juan followed the signs and posters which led through the narrow streets and towards a bridge that crossed over a polluted, stinking river. A well-lit guard post manned by US Navy MPs stood on one side. Already a line of young Filipino men with invitations in hand were waiting patiently to show them to the tall Americans. Juan waited his turn in line, then shuffled to the burly MP who looked at him impatiently. Looking over Juan's papers, the American said, "Jesus, FNR, when was the last time you ate? Look, they're serving chow till 6. Take a right past the next gate and the mess hall is the first building on your left." Juan took his papers back. He didn't stop to question what an FNR was. Instead, he nodded his head briefly before scampering ahead across the bridge, following the other Filipino young men. At the end of the bridge was a large field bisected by a well-paved road which led to the large American base. To the left was a compound surrounded by a tall chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Inside this compound, which reminded Juan of the POW camps which he'd seen in black and white American Hollywood war movies, were several 2-story wooden buildings in a row of clamshell Quonset huts. MPs directed the Filipinos to the entrance gate, where even more Navy personnel were checking IDs and paperwork, before directing them to one of the 2-story barracks buildings to drop their belongings before heading to the mess hall. There was very little talking amongst the Filipinos, as giant Americans shouted orders and instructions. Find an empty bunk and drop your shit. Quickly, quickly, quickly. Move it, move it, move it. Put your shit in those footlockers and get outside. Form up in lines of 4 so we can march your FNRs to chow. And I hope you all bought locks. You fuckers are a bunch of stinky-fingered little shits. Sorry, FNRs, yelled a big black mess cook as the Filipinos were marched into the brightly lit mess hall. We ain't got no rice or stewed dogs for you. Grab your tray and move your asses down the line. A scoop of runny scrambled eggs, a couple of fatty sausages, 2 slices of toast, and grits were dumped on their trays as they passed through the serving line. At the end of the line was a table with large bowls of apples and oranges, as well as small boxes of orange juice. One, just get one, yelled another American who obviously didn't like being up so early in the morning. 1 fruit and 2 boxes of juice. Swallow your food and chew it later. You fuckers got a long day ahead of you. Now move it, move it, move it. Juan found a seat on one of the crowded benches, his mouth watering to enjoy this bountiful feast. He passed a table where his cousins were seated together, looking as if they'd rested well after a long night's sleep. They looked at him, sneering derisively, and turned to ignore him as if he didn't exist. Joseph, the man he'd sat next to on the bus with the sick child, waved at Juan and invited him to sit. Eat everything that you can, Joseph said without looking up from his meal. We have a long day of testing today, and you want to do your best. At the end of the day, many of us won't be here. As it turned out, Joseph was right. Testing began immediately after breakfast, starting with a timed 1-mile run around the compound perimeter. The looks given to the FNRs, or Filipino naval recruits, by the Americans running the testing did not match the warm and inviting smiles which Juan had seen on the recruiting posters. Later on, a rumor spread amongst the Filipinos that FNR really stood for Filipino Navy Rejects, or Not Ready, amongst the doubtful American sailors. The Americans tested this batch of 1,000 Filipinos over the next 3 days to see who would be qualified to fill the 300 available slots, eliminating those that didn't qualify at the end of each day. Despite having almost no rest on the first day, Juan was among the first 700 Filipinos who were selected to continue the testing. By the end of the 3rd day, there were less than 500 Filipinos left. Juan's cousins had been eliminated by the end of the 2nd day, but Juan and Joseph were still there. By the end of the 3rd day, the names of the 300 Filipinos who would be accepted into U.S. Navy recruit training at Great Lakes, Michigan, would be announced. Juan spent a sleepless night at the end of that 3rd day. His friend Joseph was number 300. He'd made it. Joseph would be able to use the medical benefits offered to him by the U.S. Navy to treat his son. Juan placed 301. The Navy had paid for Juan's bus ticket to take him all the way back to his mountain village. He would leave after breakfast the next morning. At wake-up the next morning, Juan didn't feel like eating. He spent that time stuffing his meager belongings into his knapsack and finding that his new socks and running shoes had been stolen. He'd failed. He'd placed all of his hopes and dreams on this one and only shot at a better life, and he blew it. His cousins, yes, they also got eliminated. They came from wealthy families who had the political backing to try as often as they needed to. Juan wasn't that lucky. Fuck. He was born unlucky and will probably die unlucky. He spent his entire life in a poor farming village in the Philippines as the perpetually drunken bastard son of a Japanese soldier. De Guzman. Juan de Guzman. Are you in here? Juan turned to see a big black Navy NCO approaching him. Yeah, you Juan de Guzman? Juan simply nodded. I'll speak up, FNR, yelled the American. You're gonna have to learn to sound off at Great Lakes, son. Juan gave a surprised look. "Yeah, de Guzman," said the American. "You made it. You're number 300. The guy ahead of you dropped out at the last second. Seems like his son passed away last night. Now, ain't you one lucky SOB?" Part 2. 30 days later, Juan and 299 other Filipinos were at the United States Naval Recruit Training Facility in Great Lakes, Michigan, where they trained alongside their American counterparts to become sailors in the U.S. Navy. After boot camp graduation, most of the newly minted Filipino sailors were sent to their advanced schools where they trained to fulfill menial, yeomanry tasks such as cooks, administrative, or clerical work for the fleet, while the real Navy sailors did the fighting. And even though many of the Filipino sailors scored higher than their counterparts in their aptitude tests, they'd have to start at below the bottom once they joined the fleet. And that's exactly what happened after graduation from A school. After a 1-month leave time, Juan returned to the Philippines and to a hero's welcome. His family had suddenly found some worth in the half-Japanese bastard after all, the understanding being that Juan would be sending 90% of his pay to his mother as well as all of his military life insurance should something tragic befall her most beloved son. All too soon, Juan had to fly back to the States and the sprawling naval base at Norfolk, Virginia, and report to the carrier USS America as it prepared for deployment to Vietnam. About half of the Filipino sailors had been relegated as cooks and mess stewards assigned to the USS America's mess halls. Juan found himself assigned to the officers' mess, which catered to the ship's officers and pilots. It was long, arduous days, with the duty day usually starting at 4 a.m. and ending 15 or 18 hours later. It was hot, sweaty work, but despite this, Juan was having the time of his life. He was used to the long hours, and never worrying about where his next meal was coming from made him wonder why all American men weren't fighting to join the US military. True, he was still poor, as most of his money was going to his mother. But like his mother said, Juan didn't need any money anyway, since the military would take care of him. Juan was also happy to find that about a third of the people working in the officers' mess hall were Filipino. Most of the cooks were black, with the rest being white sailors. Their supervisor was a chief petty officer named Reginald Garland, a big, brawny, bald black man with a thick moustache. Chief Garland clearly loved his Filipino sailors, impressed by their punctuality, jovial attitude, and their apparent genetic trait to never complain about anything. He also enjoyed the Filipino delicacies that they made and encouraged them to indulge in doing so after duty hours. In return, the Filipino sailors loved Chief Garland, who stood as a barrier between the Filipinos and the mostly white officers who tended to be rather loose and frequent with their anti-Asian comments. Juan had even earned a nickname, Goose, after his last name, de Guzman. While their black counterparts enjoyed the Filipino cuisine, the Filipinos also grew to love the Motown music that played in the kitchen while they made the daily meals. It was 3 months into the tour, and already F-4 Phantoms from the USS America had been credited with multiple missions into the PAC-6, and even succeeded in shooting down one enemy MiG-21 fighter. But the America had also lost a few Phantoms and A-7 Corsair II strike fighters to accidents and ground fire, and 7 pilots had either been killed or critically wounded. Still, as far as wars go, Juan felt blessed. He was actually having an easier time here on the carrier than when he worked on the family farm. Who knows? After his enlistment, he maybe wouldn't go back to the Philippines. His experiences in the Navy had taught him that there was a whole new world out there, and that he could accomplish what he thought was impossible. Perhaps he'd move to the States and make America his new home. These thoughts were going through Juan's mind as he set out a large tray of warm, thick ham and cheese sandwiches on the serving line and began covering it up with plastic wrap. The PAC-6 over Hanoi. 8 A-7 Corsair II strike fighters of Attack Squadron VA-66, the Waldos, from the USS America, pulled up to 15,000 feet, high over the thick grey clouds that obscured their target, and took a circular route around Hanoi. The Navy's newest strike fighter, the A-7 Corsair II, had been nicknamed Sloof, or Short Little Ugly Fucker, because of his ungainly appearance that made it unattractive as a fighter, but which also made it a superlative attack bomber. The weather had closed in around Hanoi, socking in the target area with rain and dense clouds which dropped to 1,300 feet. This forced the strike package to abandon the day's main target and divert to a secondary target southwest of Hanoi, a vast warehouse complex which U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara had promised held NVA stockpiles of weapons, missiles, and other equipment. However, the Navy aviators knew that SecDef McNamara's supposed warehouse complex was a large empty dirt field, crisscrossed by dirt tracks and surrounded by more empty dirt fields, pot-marked by bombs which the Navy had hit several times in the past. The 8 A-7E Corsairs dived and dutifully dropped their ordnance on the absolutely valueless dirt fields, just as the American Secretary of Defense had ordered them to do. In return, they were met with North Vietnamese anti-aircraft fire from 23mm and 57mm guns who knew the Americans were coming, but, fortunately, failed to score any vital hits on the departing A-7 strike aircraft. Lieutenant Paul Johnson banked right, following his flight leader as he pulled up and away from the useless target. There were no secondary explosions, as expected, because there were absolutely no NVA warehouses below them. But there was a shit ton of 57mm ground fire exploding just behind them as the NVA gunners chased the Americans away. Lieutenant Johnson landed his Corsair on the deck of the carrier, and after the yellow and blue shirts parked his jet on the crowded flight deck, Johnson shut down his slough and made a beeline towards the mess deck. The American pilot was the poster boy of a true American hero, a young, tall, blonde-haired and blue-eyed warrior fighting against those damned Asian communists before they completely overrun America. Lieutenant Johnson had missed breakfast that morning and was already starving when the squadron launched for the morning sortie. The weather was clearing over Hanoi, and he was sure that the old man would try to get another sortie into the original target area before sundown and night ops began. Upon entering the empty mess hall, it was between serving times, the pilot stormed into the serving line, his stomach growling. The smell of delicious ham and cheese sandwiches drew his attention to a large tray being set out on the counter by a little Filipino servant. Without saying a word, Lieutenant Johnson strode forward, reaching out to grab a couple of sandwiches. To his surprise, the little Filipino pulled the tray away from the starving pilot. "What the fuck are you doing, you little shit?" yelled Johnson. "Come here with that." Lieutenant Johnson made to walk around the counter, looking to express his frustrations of the day by giving this impudent Filipino a good punch in his little brown face. Defiantly, the Filipino pointed at a handwritten sign written on cardboard that had been placed on the counter. "These sandwiches are not to be served before 1600 hours by order of Captain Lassiter." The note was signed by Chief Garland. Johnson looked down at his watch. It was 1550 hours. Close enough. The American pilot walked past the sign, completely disregarding the order from the ship's captain. "Look, you little sack of shit. You and your little Filipino friends are living here all nice and safe, while the rest of us are fighting against your people. If you don't give me a fucking ham and cheese sandwich, so help me, I will kill—" "Hey!" A boisterous, deep voice boomed across the mess hall, loud enough to stop Lieutenant Johnson in his tracks. The sweating Chief Garland stormed out of the kitchen, cheerful Motown music playing in the background. "Can you read the sign, sir? Those are captain's orders. Why don't you relax?" Then, still glaring at the pilot, Chief Garland said, "Goose, why don't you make the lieutenant here a cheeseburger?" "Fuck that," yelled Johnson, who was already angry enough that an Asian wouldn't feed him, and now an enlisted black was trying to tell him what to do. He attempted to grab 2 sandwiches off the tray, but as it was covered with plastic wrap, the pilot ended up dumping the entire tray of sandwiches on the floor. To his surprise, the little Filipino picked up the hefty spatula which he'd been using to flip burgers and smashed it down on the pilot's hand as hard as he could. An hour and a half later, Lieutenant Johnson, Seaman Third Class de Guzman, and Senior Mess Chief CPO Garland were in the office of the CO of the USS America, Captain Bruce Lassiter, and standing at attention in front of his desk. Lieutenant Johnson had his right hand heavily bandaged from the second-degree burns he'd suffered when Seaman de Guzman smacked his hand with the hot spatula. Captain Lassiter was a lean 6'3" officer with a thin, sharp face, bushy white eyebrows, and close-cropped white hair, who was famous for being short-tempered and impatient when rules and regulations were broken. "Chief Garland," he yelled. "What the hell are you doing in my office's mess? Why do I have a damn pilot standing here with his hand bandaged?" "Well, sir," answered Garland in a deep tone which indicated he wasn't used to being dressed down, "Lieutenant Johnson failed to obey the sign about the ham and cheese sandwiches. So when Seaman de Guzman here attempted to stop him, it resulted in the tray falling to the floor." "And is that why me and my command staff had nothing to eat during the 1600 command and staff briefing today?" barked Captain Lassiter. "Yes, sir," replied Garland. "That's why there were no sandwiches available for your command briefing. Lieutenant Johnson here, Lieutenant Johnson gulped, finally realizing his mistake. "Is that true, Lieutenant?" interrupted Lassiter. Yes, sir," replied Johnson. "I attempted to take the sandwiches when Seaman de Guzman hit my hand with a spatula." "That's enough," yelled CPT. Lassiter, banging both fists on the table, glared at Seaman de Guzman, furious that the Navy had allowed such people to join. "Lieutenant Johnson, you had better unfuck yourself as of yesterday. You had better learn to be careful and not to trust these little Asian bastards. I can't afford to keep pilots off the roster, so until your hand heals fully, you'll be flying close air support missions in Pack 3 and 4. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," gulped Johnson. "Good. Now get the hell out of my office and tell your commander to get his ass in here when I'm done." Johnson snapped a salute and scampered out of the office, glaring at Juan as he left. Juan and Chief Garland also made to leave, but Lassiter stopped them. "Not so fast there, Seaman Samurai," yelled Captain Lassiter. Juan moved to speak, but the enraged captain cut him off. "Shut up. God damn it, my father fought against your kind back in Saipan and Coral Sea, and now I've got to put up with you attacking my pilots. You think your little Asian ass is going to get away with karate chopping one of my attack pilots and keeping him from flying missions in the Pack 6 for a couple of weeks? You like fighting? Well, fine. Pack your bags then. I'm assigning your ass to the Brown Water Navy out in the Mekong. Get the hell out of my face." "Just a minute, sir." Chief Garland's voice was low and stern. "I'll keep him in the back in the kitchen and away from the serving line. Seaman de Guzman is not combat trained for the Mekong. That's a whole different world." "Really?" snapped Lassiter before turning to Juan. "It's the jungle. You're from the jungle, ain't you, boy? You Asians thrive in the jungle, right? You want to prove that you're a loyal American, right, boy? You want to do your part and kill some stinking commies that are making your kind look bad, right? Why don't you get out there and prove yourself to be a good, old red, white, and blue little man?" Lassiter leaned back in his seat, glaring at Juan. "You don't have to do this, Seaman de Guzman," whispered Chief Garland. Juan looked up at his friend Chief Garland with a determined expression, then turned to Captain Lassiter and smiled. Part 3. The Mekong Delta, 2 weeks later. "Okay, Goose, target's coming up on the left this time. Let's see what you got." The skinny black sailor was shirtless, wearing a well-worn flak vest and a beret as he yelled into the roaring wind. A grey-green PBR, short for Patrol Boat Riverine, sped down the stinking brown waters of the Mekong Delta, throwing up a tremendous wake behind it. A group of thatched huts sat nestled on the left bank of a small clearing where the thick, triple-canopy jungle came to the shoreline. Juan was in the fore of the swiftly speeding little assault craft, sitting in the shielded, rotating gunner's tub behind twin 50-cal machine guns. As the PBR, known as a pibber to the sailors surveying the Brown Water Navy, raced past the huts, Juan traversed the turret and let loose with a long burst from the twin 50s, which ripped into the empty huts. "Whoa!" yelled the black sailor enthusiastically. "I think we got us a real bona fide gunner here, Chief." "I see that," yelled the boat's commander, a petty officer first class named James Herrera with a heavy Mexican accent as he piloted the small attack boat from within the shaded pilot's cabin. Spinning the wheel around for another pass on the simulated targets, the 35-year-old Mexican-American sailor, sporting dark sunglasses and a thick mustache, said, "Let's get 'em familiarized with firing the LAW, and let's get the hell out of here." I don't like being in the dead space for too long, even during the daytime." The black sailor, a petty officer third class named Michael Dublin, who served as the Pibber's engine man, helped Juan out of the foregunner's position and pointed him to proceed aft. As Dublin took his place inside the gunner's tub, Juan carefully made his way to the rear of the 32-foot-long bouncing patrol boat. The last member of the four-man crew was named Anthony Burgess, a skin, hasty white petty officer second class who wore thick eyeglasses and often smelled of sunscreen, and handed Juan a fiberglass olive green tube. "Yeah, I remember how to use the rocket launcher, right?" said Burgess, handing Juan the launcher tube. Like Dublin, Burgess was shirtless save for a flak vest. Because of the extreme humidity of the Mekong Delta, especially in the hundreds of miles of inland canals, sailors often eschewed from wearing their usual olive green blouses, which quickly became soaked in sweat, and simply wore their flak vests. Juan nodded, smiling as he took and expanded the telescoping launching tube. "Okay, brother man," said Burgess. "You know what to do. Target's coming up on your right. Just for gosh sakes, clear your rear before you fire. The LAW got a 90-foot backblast." As Herrera gunned the engines of the Pibber towards the targets, Juan steadied himself on the aft deck of the bouncing craft, sighted in on the targets, and pressed the rubber firing detent of the launcher. The 72mm rocket flew straight and true into the middle of the hut, trailing white smoke, and expanded in a brilliant flash. Juan lowered the now useless tube, a smile on his face. "Good shot, Goose," said Burgess, patting Juan on the back. "You can cook and shoot. You're a whole lot better off here in the Delta than on the ship, man, believe me." "Okay, let's get the hell out of here," said Herrera, turning the boat around and heading at full speed towards more open channels of the Delta. "Dead space gives me the creeps." "Yeah, me too," agreed Burgess. Zone Echo Fox 4608 to Zone Echo Juliet 4880 on the tactical maps, nicknamed the Dead Zone by the sailors of the Brownwater Navy, was an area roughly 35 miles in diameter located in the more narrow inland channels of the Mekong Delta. The Mekong Delta itself was 15,600 square miles and encompassed the entirety of South Vietnam, lying immediately west of the South Vietnamese capital of Saigon. Due to the thousands of canals and tributaries which crisscrossed this fertile region, the Mekong Delta was considered the breadbasket of the nation and has been the major producer of agriculture and fishing for centuries. Unfortunately, when war broke out between the Communist North and the American-backed South Vietnamese government, the triple canopy jungle of the Mekong Delta area also proved to be the ideal area for the Communist Viet Cong, the VC, and the North Vietnamese Army, NVA, to smuggle large quantities of weapons, establish large weapons caches, and concentrate troops for strikes against Americans and government troops. With literally tens of thousands of small motorboats and sampans of all shapes and sizes navigating the inland waterways every day, the threat of communist troop and resupply movement was a very real one. To counter this threat, the US Navy established the Mobile Riverine Force, colloquially known as the Brownwater Navy, for the silt and brackish waters that flowed through most of the Delta. And this force consisted of several large barrack ships anchored offshore that acted as the headquarters for squadrons of smaller gunboats. These gunboats consisted of heavily armed and armored monitor gunboats, which acted as the floating tanks of the squadron. Additionally, there were swift boats, which acted as floating assault transports similar to the tracked M113 armored personnel carriers that the Army used on land. By far the most numerous of the boats consisted of the PBR, or Pibber, a small assault craft. Heavily armed with multiple machine gun mounts, it was very lightly protected, relying on its speed and maneuverability to get out of enemy ambushes from the shore. To assist in their mission, the Navy even converted specialized ships to be helicopter gunship carriers that could be called at a moment's notice to provide an air support should a patrol boat need aerial gunship fire. Still, for all of the men and material that the Navy invested to secure the inland waterways in Operation Game Warden and Operation Market Time, there were never enough boats and never enough men to properly patrol the thousands of miles of canals and tributaries that made up the Mekong. That's how Juan was pulled from his duties as a cook aboard one of the floating barrack ships and found himself as a gunner aboard one of the squadron's Pibbers. The sailor Juan replaced had been medevaced by helicopter from the Mekong 2 days ago, though not from combat injury. Apparently, that sailor contracted a particularly damaging strain of a sexually transmitted disease from one of the thousands of prostitutes which enticed American GIs on the streets of Saigon. The crew of Juan's Pibber breathed a sigh of relief after they left the constricting tributary of the dead zone and headed out into more open, bluer channels which brought them farther from the shore. "The dead zone is what we call that area, because it's just that. It's dead," explained Herrera to a curious Juan. Herrera throttled down the Pibber as they reached the open waters. Now out of the range of most VC small arms fire, Burgess and Dublin relaxed their visual scanning for shoreline threats. "Yeah, man, it's all lush with vegetation and all that shit. Nothing seems to live out there," continued Herrera, no longer needing to shout over the engine noise. "The locals say that anyone who tries to start a village there always seems to vanish, so they don't even travel through that place. Even the VC don't seem to go there. When I first got into Nam, I heard stories that a full VC rifle battalion went into the dead zone to establish a forward supply base. They were never heard from again. Our sea wolves fly over that area all the time. They never see anything, not even large game animals. Sometimes they see weird tracks which emerge from the triple canopy jungle and go into one of the canals. Other times they report something massive which seems to move unseen beneath the canopy. It mostly gets explained away as the downdraft from the helicopter rotors. Occasionally we patrol the dead zone. Nothing really goes on there. Mostly we just use it as a shooting range to give the new guys gunnery practice since no civilians live out there." Nodding in understanding, Juan moved to the aft of the boat, where Burgess was lounging next to the twin M60 machine guns, enjoying a can of peaches and syrup. About 3 miles to the south, 3 C-130 Hercules transport aircraft lumbered low in the sky just above the tree line. Flying in a V formation, they were trailing a long line of chemicals from hoses that felt like a mist on the foliage below. "That's defoliant," said Burgess to Juan. "It's called Agent Orange. Wipes out the trees and vegetation for miles so that old Victor Charles doesn't have a place to hide and set up ambushes and shit. Leaves kind of an oily taste in your mouth when you walk through an area sprayed with the stuff. The government says it's harmless to humans." For Lieutenant Paul Johnson, his time flying close air support missions south of the dreaded PAC-6 in North Vietnam had been an eye-opener regarding his view of the entire war. His view had always been that it was the Americans, partly the white Americans, who'd been carrying the brunt of the war on their shoulders, and that the army of South Vietnam, known as ARVN, were weak, if not useless, allies in the fight to free their country. However, these flying missions had revealed that nearly 3 out of 4 requests for close air support were for ARVN troops in contact with the enemy. Not only were the ARVN doing a good measure of the fighting, they were taking the brunt of the casualties. Another thing that he quickly realized was that over South Vietnam, he was actually making a difference. As opposed to North Vietnam, where the US was taking tremendous losses dropping bombs on Secretary of Defense McNamara's near useless targets, in South Vietnam, Lieutenant Johnson was actually hitting live enemy targets. More importantly, he was saving the lives of American and Allied troops who were in close contact with the enemy. Johnson found that he preferred missions over South Vietnam. Not because they were generally safer than the PAC-6, but because for once he felt as if he was actually contributing something quantifiable to the overall war effort. He pulled his A-7 Corsair up after hitting several enemy automatic weapons which had been firing on a platoon of ARVN soldiers 15 miles north of Saigon. The American FAC assigned to the ARVN Rangers confirmed that Lieutenant Johnson's ordnance landed danger close to their position, but was successful in taking out the enemy which had been threatening their right flank. The ARVN Rangers were attempting to fall back so they could call Artie to wipe out the entire grid square, but were having difficulty medevacing their wounded due to heavy fire coming from the north. The attack fighter banked around and dived again, this time approaching from the south, and Johnson pickled the last of his napalm on the offending VC positions. As the ground below him erupted in fiery clouds of the thick black oily smoke, Johnson backed his Corsair to the right, which brought him close to a ridgeline overgrown with jungle vegetation. Unbeknownst to Johnson, the NVA had somehow placed 2 twin 57mm cannons on the summit, which they'd been using to fire on American helicopters. The high explosive fragmentation rounds peppered Johnson's A7 as he streaked overhead, the concussion of impacts nearly flipping the stout little fighter over. Fortunately, Johnson was able to maintain control of his wounded fighter, although his cockpit warning lights and warning noises made him feel as if he were on the inside of a fire engine's flashing lights. He had no idea how badly damaged his fighter was. Johnson immediately contacted air traffic control and advised them to his critical situation, informing them that he was at approximately 3,000 feet and that it was doubtful he could make it back to the USS America. Air Control advised Johnson that the nearest airbase at Tan Son Nhut was socked in by rain and to divert south to Bin Toi Air Base located in the Mekong Delta. Johnson pulled the stick as gently as he could, coasting his planes towards a southwesterly direction. The rugged little slough held together for another 4 minutes before a deafening bang shook the entire plane. Art 4. The Dead Zone. It was late afternoon, 3 days after Juan and the Pibber crew visited the Dead Zone. The skies were darkening to the color of the brackish, muddy waters, signaling the rain which usually came at this time of day during the summer months. It was still too early to call it a day and return to the barrack ship, so Herrera was contemplating pulling in near the shore to the overhang of palm trees to wait out the rain when a call came over the radio. An A7 Corsair just went down in the vicinity of grid Echo Fox 476337, and since they were the nearest boat in the area, Herrera was to go there and secure the crash site and search until SAR, search and rescue, assets could arrive. Responding in the affirmative and telling his crew to man the guns, Herrera checked the location on his map. His heart sank. That location was almost dead center of the dead zone. The skies were darkening, and the temperature was getting cooler as the Pibber swiftly skimmed over the tops of the brown waves. Rescuing a downed pilot wasn't a mission often called for by the Brown Water Navy, so Herrera and the crew knew that this was a bad situation. Even Juan could feel the tension with the crew, as Herrera announced their destination and that they had about an hour to get the pilot to safety before the rains hit. Before long, they could see the thick black smoke rising above the triple canopy jungle, just behind a bend in the canal. Overhead, a grey-painted Seawolf helicopter gunship circled around the billowing black smoke. Strangely, the pilot seemed to be lining his helicopter up for attack passes on the downed aircraft. Perplexed, Herrera throttled down the boat and brought it around the bend in the canal. "Dios mío," gulped Herrera. "What the hell is that?" The rest of the crew froze at the sight before them, jaws agape, eyes unbelieving. Lieutenant Johnson's stricken A7 Corsair had crashed into the unforgiving thick jungle and had skidded for nearly 100 meters before coming to rest at the shore, the nose section jutting just over the water. Most of the Corsair's wings and rear horizontal stabilizers had been torn off in the crash, leaving only the battered fuselage remaining. But that wasn't what was keeping the rescue helicopters at bay, and what was striking fear and disgust in the hearts of the Pibber crew. It was the fact that an impossibly large, Titanic-sized snake was slowly wrapping itself around the fuselage of the downed fighter jet. Sitting 30 meters offshore, the stunned crew could see the massive constrictor slowly crushing the fuselage, each shining grey-green scale on the serpent's impossibly long body easily 3 feet square. It gave off a hideous, foul smell, made worse every time it exhaled. Demonic black eyes 7 feet in diameter stared out of a triangular head, which itself was 20 feet long from the base of its neck to the tip of its snout. The Titanic boa paid little attention to the circling helicopter or the terrified crew of the Pibber, instead focusing its deadly intent on the unconscious pilot sitting in the crushed cockpit of the plane. "We can't get a clear shot," radioed the gunship pilot. "If we hit it, we'll likely take out the pilot as well." "I copy," yelled Herrera into the radio. "Dublin, man. You got a shot?" At this range, it's hard to miss, yelled the black sailor, still manning the forward guns. Take the shot, ordered Herrera, and Dublin's twin 50s punched out round after round into the side of the monster, taking out huge chunks of its flesh. This only served to draw the serpent's attention to the crew of the Pibber, and it lifted its head 30 feet into the sky in surprise and annoyance, causing the attack helicopter to pull up to avoid colliding with it. The serpent unhinged its jaws in anger to reveal rows of hooked teeth 3 feet long and a more wide enough to swallow the Pibber and its whole crew. The beast exhaled with a long baritone hiss, which made Juan and the others gag and eyes tear up from the noxious fumes. "Oh shit," exclaimed Burgess as he unloaded with the twin 60s mounted at the rear of the Pibber, while Dublin again fired the twin 50s at the front. Juan also fired at the Titanic Snake from an M60 machine gun mounted on a pintle just behind Herrera as Herrera prepared to shove the Pibber into reverse. The beast's head flung backwards, mouth still open, and collapsed in a heap unseen behind the rest of its body. Immediately, Juan jumped down into the brown muddy waters of the delta, which came up past his waist and began splashing towards shore. "Goose," yelled the forward gunner. "What the hell did we tell you about never leaving the boat?" Juan simply gave him a stern look and pointed toward the downed corsair wrapped in the coils of the Titanic serpent. "Yeah, then, you crazy little shit. Take this." Herrera heaved an M72 rocket launcher towards Juan. "We'll keep you covered, but if that thing moves again, get the hell out of the way, because we're frying it." Quickly, Juan waded to the shore and, recoiling at the sheer mass of the serpent, climbed up on the A7's forward fuselage. He shuddered as a coil of the god serpent was just inches away from the rear of the cockpit. Fortunately, the canopy had been blown away by the impact of the crash, and Juan reached down past the broken glass to grab the pilot. Juan froze briefly as he recognized the unconscious pilot, who he was risking his life to save. "Goose, look out!" Juan leaped backwards off the cockpit and tumbled into the water as soon as he heard the warning from the Pibber crew. He was just barely cognizant of being hit by the bottom jaw of the serpent's maw and a wet, humid hiss of foul, rotten air. Quickly, Juan stood up and pulled the LAW from his back as the serpent towered over him, more opened wide as it prepared to strike again. Extending the tube of the M72 rocket launcher, Juan placed it up to his shoulder and took aim, looking back quickly to make sure his 90-foot backblast area was clear. Then, with a defiant, "Fuck you, you motherfucker," Juan depressed the rubber-triggering boot of the launcher. The 72mm high-explosive rocket flew straight and true into the serpent's wide-open maw, whose jaws had extended to nearly 20 feet wide. The warhead exploded in the back of the monstrous serpent's neck, blasting gore and viscera out of a bowling ball-sized hole at the top of its skull. As the smoking titan's head fell backwards, Juan climbed up to the cockpit again and unbuckled the unconscious pilot from his seat. Heaving the much heavier pilot over his shoulder, Juan jumped down into the soft brown muck and brine below, just seconds before the spasmodic constrictions of the severely wounded serpent finally crushed the fighter. From above, the circling Navy UH-1 gunship dived into a hover between the serpent and Juan, as Han half dragged and half shoved the Corsair pilot into the water back towards his waiting gunboat. Once Juan and the pilot were clear, the helicopter pilot unleashed a deadly torrent of bullets and rocket fire on the still quivering mountain that was the coils of this almighty serpent. Surprisingly, the serpent was still moving, albeit it was still clearly hurt, as large chunks had been torn from the length of its body. The gunboat pulled up next to Juan and the pilot, Herrera and Burgess jumping in the water to help an exhausted Juan drag the pilot into the boat, while Dublin fired the twin 50 caliber machine guns at the serpent as it uncoiled from the now wrecked Corsair to slither slowly away into the jungle. "Jeez, look at the size of that thing," exclaimed the Huey gunship's co-pilot. "The thing has to be at least 150 to 200 feet long. Its body is about 25 feet wide." "I'm going to expand all the ordnance we have left," said the pilot, amazed that the thing was still slinking off to disappear under the deep jungle canopy. Oh, I hope it's enough. Hey, how's our flyboy doing? He's aboard, said Herrera as he throttled his gunboat to reverse course from the shore and head for deeper waters, just in case the Serpent decided to double back and finish them off. The rush of cool wind and the falling rain served to revive Lieutenant Johnson as Herrera raced his gunboat as fast as he could take it away from the dead zone and back to the barrack ship. Johnson blinked his eyes in recognition at the little Filipino sailor staring down at him with a big smile on his face. "What? You? Rest easy, flyboy," said Juan, grinning down at him as he handed the stunned pilot a canteen of water. "When we get back to base, I'll make you a fucking ham and cheese sandwich." Postscript. And so, 60 years later, as I finish this story and close my laptop, I pray that I did justice to my good friend. Juan, or as his friends called him, Goose, was a remarkable guy, a loyal friend, and a loving husband to his wife Nellie of over 50 years. He also fathered a son, an Afghanistan war veteran who's now fighting in Iraq. We stayed in touch even long after the two of us retired and remained close friends until he passed. He passed away last year due to the long-term complications resulting from Agent Orange. Now I feel like making a hot ham and cheese sandwich, but sadly, no one made them better than you, Goose. With undying respect, Rear Admiral Paul Johnson, U.S. Navy, retired. Formerly Lieutenant Paul Johnson, A-7E Corsair II Strike Fighter pilot, 1964 to 1969. TAC Squadron VA-66, The Waldos, Yankee Station, Republic of Vietnam. Author's note. The use of Agent Orange, a known toxic, cancer-causing agent sprayed over densely populated areas of South Vietnam, was the brainchild of U.S. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, known as Operation Ranch Hand. Like his other brainchild, Operation Rolling Thunder, Operation Ranch Hand was a disaster which failed on every level to achieve its objectives and instead sickened millions. The toxic agent was responsible for affecting over 3 million South Vietnamese with various kinds of cancers and was responsible for affecting even newborn babies a generation later. Roughly 40,000 American service members who served in South Vietnam are reported to suffer from the effects of Agent Orange, but the overall estimate is suspected to be as much as 80,000. As of 2024, the United States government's Department of Veterans Affairs has compensated less than 400 families from the after effects of Agent Orange. It's still the official contention of the United States government that Agent Orange is harmless and safe for use, but the Department of Defense has been ordered to never use it again.